Matt, are you an optimist or a pessimist?
I am an optimist at heart. I believe firmly in human ingenuity and the ability for things to generally improve over time. I would note that I might be in a minority at the moment. Consumer confidence is very low. There's a slide that shows that, but consumer confidence, the series that ANZ Roy Morgan put out, is around the lowest level it's been since it started reporting in 1973. So that's how people feel about the economy. But generally speaking, I'm optimistic.
And why you, if not others?
Um, I'm taking a bigger picture view. So I think if you look at data over time, human ingenuity leads to productivity. Productivity leads to higher living standards. I do think productivity, whilst it's been a little bit suppressed in Australia of late, will re-emerge because I think the human spirit is to always explore and invent and create. So I think over the fullness of time, things will get better. But consumer sentiment surveys are really barometers about where people think they are now and where they're going to be in the next 12 months. So I think the difference between how I feel is the time frame I'm thinking about, and how people are feeling is the time frame they're thinking about, which is on the shorter end of things.
So the two main players for us and for the economy are Michele Bullock at the Reserve Bank and Jim Chalmers, Treasurer. Do you think Michele Bullock's going to and her board are going to be able to achieve their goals?
So probably worth clarifying what their goals are. They've got two goals. They've got two mandates. So full employment is the first mandate, and inflation at 2.5% is the second mandate. Those goals tend to be in conflict with each other. When you have full employment, it means you're at full supply capacity in the economy, which means inflation is more likely to emerge. And when you've got low inflation, low and steady inflation, it can sometimes mean you've got slack in the economy, supply capacity, and so you might have slightly elevated unemployment. Right now, we're at a situation where the economy has been outside its inflation target, since 2022, so for coming up to 5 years, so far too long. But we've been at full employment for the past 5 years, so they are finding it very difficult to achieve one of their two goals at the moment. And I think the recent hawkish pivot from the RBA signals that they're running out of patience on getting back to their target of 2.5% inflation. I would note other central banks around the world, not all of them have a dual mandate. They just have an inflation target, like our friends in New Zealand. So they tend to have, when you're focused on one, you tend to be better at achieving the one you're focused on. We haven't managed to achieve that in Australia yet.
So you are expecting a rate hike in that case.
The markets are certainly pricing in a rate hike. I think inflation expectations for the first time almost since inflation has been elevated are creeping quite a bit higher in Australia. And I think people can see that inflation pressures are re-emerging. I think our muscle memory is there. I think that's probably the most concerning part of where we are for the central bank. I think the RBA would be very concerned that if inflation expectations become unanchored, that then feeds into higher inflation as people raise their prices preemptively. They're going to want to crush that. That's the most concerning part about inflation at the moment. So I think it's realistic to expect interest rate hikes, plural potentially, until expectations around inflation moderate again.
Jim Chalmers is talking about reform and resilience, or reform and restraint. Do you think he can achieve that given what's happening around us?
I think the ability to put forward good reform is it is hampered by what's happening around us, the geopolitical context. But I think that the consumer sentiment data from earlier, that tells you how much people dislike inflation. We are a fully employed economy, and yet apparently we're as unhappy as we've ever been. And so the suggestion that you know the knee-jerk reaction to any difficulty has been governments just give cost of living relief, and that would be in conflict to restraining yourself. So I do think maybe the rope has run out in terms of the level of government spending that governments can use as a lever to deal with these challenges. I think they need to show more restraint, because having not shown restraint in the past, it's starting to backfire on them in terms of the contribution to inflation. So I do think the market mechanism and the feedback around inflation and people's response to inflation, I don't know if he's got the ability to use cost of living relief as a mechanism anymore. So I do think we're going to be hopefully more restraint. Um, will he deliver that successfully? I think there's some evidence that he might. So good policy is difficult. This is the thing. Good policy can create winners and losers. It's really difficult. I thought I saw an example of good policy happening with recent superannuation tax changes. So he initially proposed a set of tax changes that the industry, particularly technicians, superannuation trustees and accountants and financial advisors, really didn't like. It had some unintended consequences. There was a strong industry response, and we saw a change or an adaptation to the initial policy proposals to something that was more manageable. Now, that to me is an example of good policy. And so if he can be receptive to feedback and, the media position that as a backflip and a negative, but I think good policy is shifting, managing your proposals to feedback. That's a good outcome. That's massaging policy to better outcomes.
And the
If
other
we
one
see
would
more of
be
that,
the recent flagging of restraint to the NDIS too.
yeah, that's a great example. And that actually follows on from an earlier statement that Chalmers said, which was that he acknowledged that government spending is contributing to inflation, which was something that he was very reticent to acknowledge in his first term. So we are seeing evidence that there is a shift in the political mindset that I think is really, that gives me I'm an optimist, but that makes me optimistic that the pathway here is positive.
And did the government buy a problem for itself by growing the public service and using that as a way of reducing unemployment?
So the government was worried, I think, when interest rates went up, that it would see higher unemployment. So it was happy to continue spending throughout the period when we were trying to bring inflation under control. But to give you some context around that, the size of government spending as a proportion of GDP in the lead up to COVID was somewhere between 20 and 25% for sort of the 30-year period in the lead up to the pandemic. During the pandemic, it expanded to 31% of GDP as we did cash flow boost, job seeker, job keeper payments. It never went back down to 25%. It sort of drifted down towards it, but then has come back up to 28% of GDP. And so that has created some supply constraints as government demand has expanded as a proportion of the economy. And so it's making it a little bit harder for the finite resources that the private sector has to compete for to produce its goods and services, which is contributing to a quicker rebound in inflation. So yes, the government certainly, as it's expanded its size, has contributed to the very sort of slow speed limit we have on economic growth.
So in the budget, we might expect a reduction in public service so that the private sector can increase its share of GDP and it contribute to productivity.
I think so. I think there's now greater general consensus that the size of government is creating some higher interest rate experiences and some inflationary outcomes that are very unpalatable. And so it's now almost more politically expedient to shrink the size of government than expand it. And so we'll probably see that outcome.
Matt, thanks very much.
Pleasure.